Again, excited to have y'all here today. This is our agenda for today. So we'll hear from the participants from their specific about their specific immersion experiences and with specific themes, namely Malaya movements. Um, uh, Points of unity on human rights, democracy, and sovereignty. Again, what Tabs was saying about, exactly 21 members of Malaya and affiliate members went to the Philippines, and we divided ourselves and integrated with a few communities. We had there will be representation from many places here. We were in NCR in the National Capital Region. And the groups divided themselves. We divided ourselves between Negros, Zambales, Bulacan, and Laguna. But we also met a lot of organizations, members of organizations who are really doing the work on the ground, including Karapatan, which is the Human Rights Alliance in the Philippines, Alter Media, an independent and progressive media outfit, and the political candidates of the Makabayan Coalition. It's and many other organizations, again, who are really doing the work on the ground and facing the conditions and repression for doing the work that they do. This is the first immersion trip that Malaya has pulled off in our years-long history. We were founded in 2018. And began to build chapters in 2020, and then pandemic hit. So this is our first trip post-pandemic to really see the conditions on the ground for ourselves, and to understand, because without seeing it for ourselves, we are not going to understand how fascism is actually manifesting on the ground in the Philippines. This is just gonna be one of many report backs, and folks have been doing them on the ground already. And again, reiterating that we want to frame today's report back on Malaya's principles of human rights, sovereignty, and democracy. So to start us off, thank you for timekeeping. To start us off, we're gonna do an overview of what is going on in the Philippines. So I'm gonna pass. Calls to action. Maybe I'll do that first. But yeah, we're gonna do these calls to action throughout. So if you're not a member yet, become a member, organized for the long term, to fight fascism, and to fight for genuine democracy. We have new shirts that will go to our Palayain Free All Political Prisoners campaign. And if you'd rather, we will not reject any donations to Malaya Movement. We are all doing this voluntarily. And of course, check out our immersion trip landing page. So these are the links, and folks are also putting them in the chat. Without further ado, I believe I can pass this off to Andrew of the San Francisco chapter of Malaya, to tell us about just giving us a general picture of what's going on back home. Andrew?
Okay. Hi. Here to talk about the situation going on. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. I was trying to look for the slides, but I found them. Yeah, so um what's going on in the Philippines? If we could go to the next slide. Um, what's going on in the Philippines are um landlessness affecting the peasants, um, And the peasants make up the majority of um, the the classes of society there. Um, they make up the majority of the population and represent the poorest class in the Philippines. They're comprised of the farmers, the fisher folk, and agricultural workers who cultivate the land and produce the majority of the country's food. Um, 7 out of 10 rural farmers in the Philippines do not own the land that they farm. Um, they're also subject to poverty due to the landlessness, government neglect and rights, and international humanitarian law. Um, and if we could go to the next slide. Um, so you can't really see it, um, but these are this is a map showing all the holdings by landlords, corporations, institutions, as well as the landowning families. And there is a lot. Um, if we could go to the next slide. Um, there's also Philippines is also dependent on foreign countries. Um, it's a export-oriented, import-dependent economy. So, sorry. It heavily focuses on exporting goods to generate income, but simultaneously relies on heavily importing goods it cannot produce domestically, meaning it needs to buy a large portion of its required products from other countries to meet domestic demand. This type of economy ensures that local industry and manufacturing remain underdeveloped, only serving as a cheap base of raw materials for foreign capital, forcing its people to buy foreign goods at inflated prices and to find work outside the country. Philippines has also been the the top recipient of U.S. military and security aid in Southeast Asia, and but they have no support to become self-reliant or to be able to protect oneself. Um, the U.S. sells old equipment to the Philippines and expands its military presence as it postures towards China. And these weapons have been used to attack peasants, workers, and human rights defenders. Um, and if we could go to the next slide. Um, so this is showing how the the Philippine economy works, and um, how it's bereft of industries producing basic metals, basic chemicals, and capital goods. Um, it has no way to process these materials, and um, it's I, we would be more self-sustaining if we were able to. If we could get to the next slide. Um, Former leaders of the Philippines have a history of pushing for policy and changes to the constitution that benefits foreign corporations primarily. To this day, there's a fight to enact charter change under Marcos Jr., which would drop the constitutional provisions with which state that Filipinos should own at least 60% of certain industries. Increased direct foreign investments have resulted in low job growth, expanded trade deficits, which hurt workers and peasants the most. Um, there, um, Despite an increase in minimum wage, people's average income and earnings are still not enough to keep up with the rising cost of food and other basic necessities. Ebon International reports that from 2000 to 2023, worker productivity jumped by 62%, but the minimum wage by 9% only. Most Filipinos are consigned to short-term, non-unionized labor contracts, which are unstable and allow for exploitation, no benefits, or worker protections. Um, I took this picture on our trip, and this was during a time where Ebon International reported that rice was at its highest price hike. Um, I'm sorry, can we? Okay, so, um, so the human rights situation. Presidents Duterte and Marcos Jr. were found guilty by the International People's Tribunal for war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law. Um, During these findings, testimony was shared implicating the Duterte regime of extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances, and attacks on indigenous communities defending their ancestral lands from mining and corporate plunder. Under Marcos Jr.'s administration, it has not fared any better. There have been enforced abductions, extrajudicial killings of NBA combatants and members belonging to farmers' orgs, indiscriminate aerial bombings and shellings of communities and counterinsurgency efforts targeting civilians. The urban poor communities are often displaced and evicted by the government and given low recourse or assistance afterwards. Can we get to the next slide? So right now, there's a rift and a split between the unit team of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte. Um, and most recently, she threatened to have him killed and claims to have hired assassins to do that. Um, Historically, political dynasties such as the Marcoses and Duterte use the vehicle of government to sell out the Philippines for their own personal gain. Both families are feuding with the potential of it exploding into political violence, which will pull resources away and distract from the need to have a strong national plan to address the chronic issues the Filipino people are facing. Um, that is all I have for what's going on in the Philippines. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for giving us an overview of what's going on in the Philippines. Really kind of taking a look at the overall picture. And as we get into the report back portion, we'll dig into the very specific ways that the things that Andrew was pointing to are manifesting on the ground. But before we get into the report back proper, wanted to share a cultural with y'all. This is a song called Kawayanan by Erickson Acosta, who is a cultural worker, former political prisoner, NDFP peace consultant who was actually murdered in Negros, in the province that I was able to go to in a supposed clash with the armed forces of the Philippines. This happened 2 years ago, almost to the day, and still no justice for Erickson and many others that have been killed by the Philippine state. And so at the end of our trip in the Philippines, we had a cultural night, and different contingents, people performed songs to just cap off our time in the Philippines. And yeah, this song performed by the folks from our California chapters, talking about waving goodbye to well, at once like waving goodbye to people that are fighting for change, but also really steadfast, like the bamboo grove that is there. This song was actually written by Erickson for the 10th anniversary of Hacienda Luisita, the Hacienda Luisita massacre. And last month was the 20th anniversary. And the song he wrote dedicated to women farmers and peasants who were present at Hacienda Luisita. And so we'll play this song. Yeah.
This song as a wave goodbye to the Philippines. And then waving hello back to our local chapter. We'll be continuing the fight in solidarity for genuine sovereignty, democracy, and human rights in the Philippines. Ayo. Wow. Yeah. This is Malaya.
Kawayan
Wow. Thank you for that for that presentation. Sorry, I'm shy. It was there. But yeah, thank you for choosing that specific clip. Yeah, so we go into like the part one of our report back, specifically focusing on the human rights situation in the Philippines. Um, uh, I mean, if folks didn't know, actually, this year is the 76th anniversary of the uh, UN General Assembly's declaration that December 10 is International Human Rights Day. So we are just a few days from International Human Rights Day. Why one of the big reasons why we're holding this report back now. And it's very relevant that that song, that we lead with that song, that was written, that was composed by a beloved cultural worker, activist, a peace consultant in the Philippines, who was murdered by the state. So clearly, even the basic human rights is not met for a majority of the people around the world, including in the Philippines. So we will dig into that a bit more, and I'll pass this off to Noreen from Malaya, DC, and Kylie from Malaya, San Francisco.
All right, thanks, y'all. So I'm gonna get us started. So on our immersion trip, we saw the stark differences between Marcos's Bagong Pilipinas and the realities of the everyday Filipino. This past June, the Department of Labor and Employment propped a 96.9% employment rate using a very loose standard for employment. For instance, if you worked 1 hour over a reference period, you were considered employed. But this reference period isn't standardized, meaning it could fluctuate between a week or several months. The story of working only 1 hour a day varies much more than 1 hour over like 3 months. On the other hand, Marcos's administration has a stringent definition for poor, where you could only be considered food poor if you could eat 3 meals a day for 64 pesos. But with the inflation of prices for staples such as rice, onions, eggs, and sugar, it's making it more difficult for the Filipino people to access nutritional food. And while the price of goods continues to rise, the minimum wage isn't rising to meet the occasion. A family of five needs to make roughly 1,200 pesos a day to cover the cost of living, but on average are making only 444 pesos a day. And this average is in the national capital region where there are more employment opportunities, which means that wages are much lower in the provinces, where farmers and fisherfolk are making closer to 178 pesos a day. In Negros, sugarcane farmers can make up to 300 pesos, but this is only when sugar is in season. So the other 6 months of the year, they're struggling to find odd jobs or construction if there's positions available. And because of these stressful living and working conditions, families in Negros have the saying, one day, one eat, referring to the choice to eat 1 meal a day so that they could send their kids to school, have a roof over their head, or make ends meet. Next slide.
Yeah, so in this video, you'll see our interview of Janila Castro. She's an environmental defender, and in this video, she'll explain really the impacts of reclamation projects in the Philippines, specifically on how it really impacts the livelihood of fisher folks, as well as, what the reclamation projects are, and even going to the point of like how the projects affect on a national level. And feel free to play it now.
Oops, sorry. Oh. Oops, not that.
I'm Janila Castro. I'm an advocacy officer of Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment. I am focusing on the reclamation projects here in the Philippines. Reclamation is a process in which, in a water body, you dump sands there in order to make another landmass, in order to create a building, a highway, something like that. The reason why they are actually choosing reclamation project instead of grabbing other land masses is because it is actually cheaper than to buy a land. With these reclamation projects, they will build their businesses, foreign businesses, in which the communities will not actually benefit. Yeah, they can work there as a construction worker, as a janitor, but that can't equal to the profit or profit that they are getting from fishing. And it's not even a regular job, because construction job is not a regular job. When the building is done, you don't have any job again. That's why we're calling these reclamation projects as a pseudo-developmental projects. It's not a development for the people, but for the profit of the few. Actually, it is causing up to 90% drop of fish catch in Manila Bay, which is the reason why the fisher folks who can still fish are now suffering. Aside from that, it will also affect our food security in a national level, because Manila Bay is actually a source of our food, of our fish, of our crabs.
Yeah, so, Janila said it best herself. These reclamation projects really displaces thousands of homes, families, and communities, and it really increases the inequality between the rich and the poor. And so it not only displaces, the fisher people, right? It also displaces the fish themselves. The loss of fish catch that Janila mentioned really threatens the livelihoods of the fisher people and the Filipino people's source of food. So fishers and workers in general, they deserve decent and proper living conditions where, their families and children can thrive and survive. And yeah, it's already on the next slide, but Kylie, take it away.
Great, thank you. So my contingent, the California contingent, got to integrate with the fisher folk in Zambales. If you could go back to the last slide. The fishermen were able to tell us how they used to be able to get a full catch and only had to go as far as the first set of waves that you see in this video. And then if you could click 3 times so the things pop up. But because of the nickel mining in Zambales, the runoff has pushed the fish farther out, meaning that the fishermen have to go just as far, and even then, a decent catch is not guaranteed. During our stay, Tatay Roland told us that he would sometimes go 15 to 20 miles out to fish, but his catch couldn't cover the cost of his diesel. And the mining is not only a disruption to fisher folks living, but their families' well-being as well. In the sign in here where they are protesting the mining in Zambales, it translates loosely to dust and mud hurt the stomachs of children. Ate Mildred, who we stayed with, told us that even though their community petitioned against the mining, they couldn't fully divorce themselves from it because when storms hit and make the waters too dangerous for fishing, they need that short-term employment, such as seasonal mine cleaning and sweeping. These jobs, though, are only up to 15 days, which goes to show that the mining company has a lot of control to keep these families in this vicious cycle of depending on them without acknowledging that they are the people and the fisher folk are the ones facing the direct impacts from the mining runoff. Next slide.
Yeah, so during our immersion trip as well, we were able to participate in a relief distribution in Barangay Tatalon. It's within Quezon City. And in Barangay Tatalon, you can see on the left, no, the flood. Barangay Tatalon is known for frequent floodings, and residents continue to face these flooding due to the inadequate flood systems that the government has yet to, enhance in order to keep up with the most typhoons that's been happening, and that the barangay itself also is right next to a river. So, when a typhoon hits, the barangay, the flood water can reach up to like 10 feet high, where, residents can't leave their homes and have very little time to save their belongings. So we were able to, witness and help Migrante International in their relief distribution efforts, where a total of 250 packs were provided to families. Next slide. And then at the end of the relief distribution, we were able to interview Mimi Doringo. She is one of the Makabayan Coalition candidates, and she represents the urban poor sector. And in this video, she'll talk about multiple topics ranging from the issues of the urban poor sector and the conditions that pushes our, not just the urban poor people, but the Filipinos in the Philippines, that pushes them to work or move abroad.
Ako si Mimi Doringo, Secretary General ng Kadamay, at bilang isa sa mga victim survivors ng Undoy, yung Kadamay ay galing sa sektor ng mga maralitang tagalungsod. At kaya ako tinanggap yung hamon na maging isa sa makabayan slate natin sa Senado, dahil gusto ko magkaroon talaga ng boses ng mga kapwa ko mga maralita. Kaya nung namulat talaga ako, sabi ko nga, mahirap na talagang pumikit, at kahit nakapikit ka, mapapanaginipan mo, kailangan mo maging boses ka ng kapwa mo mga maralita. Dahil kami nakakaranas ng epekto ng mataas na presyo ng mga bilihin, kawalan ng akses sa pagpapaaral sa aming mga anak, kawalan ng akses sa pangkalusugan, kaya't alam namin, kayang-kaya naming bigyan ng solusyon at katugunan yung matagal ng hinaing ng mga kapwa maralita. At ngayong panahon na nagbigay yung mga kasama mula sa Migrante International sa tulong ng mga katulad ninyo na nakikiisa sa laban ng mga kapwa mga maralita na kumaharap dun sa at naging biktima ng Bagyong Karina hanggang sa enteng ng mga nakaraang buwan. Kaya nandito tayo sa Tatalon para doon sa ipamimigay ng mga relief operation. Sa matagal ng panahon, mula doon sa mga magsasaka na inaagawan ng lupa sa probinsya o kaya nagkakaroon ng matinding atake sa kanilang buhay, kaya napipilitan silang lumuwas sa Metro Manila sa pangrahangad na mapaunlad yung kabuhayan ng kanilang pamilya. Pero dahil pagdating pa rin dito sa lungsod, wala naman talagang espasyong ibinibigay ang ating pamahalaan na magiging disente at maayos ang kanilang pamumuhay, kaya masasadlak sila sa mga sa gilid ng riles ng tren, sa gilid ng mga kailugan o tubigan, sa ilalim ng mga tulay, dahil walang ginagawang trabaho ang ating pamahalaan dito sa Pilipinas. Kaya mapipilitan ang mga pamilya, ang mga magulang, iwanan ang kanilang mga anak para mag-abroad. Sa tingin, mas malaki ang kikitain. Yung isang buwan sahod sa ibang bansa ay katumbas na halos ng isang taon na sinasahod ng manggagawa sa Pilipinas. Pero syempre masakit yon. Masakit bilang magulang na iwanan mo yung anak mo, ipapaalagaan mo sa iyong kapamilya, pero ikaw mismo mag-aalaga ka rin ng ibang bata sa abroad, di ba? Yun yung madalas na kwento ng mga kasama natin sa Hong Kong at sa iba't iba pang Asian country kung saan nagiging domestic helper. Na bandang huli, maiisip nila, hindi naman din sapat ang sinasahod dito sa Pilipinas. At kailangan dahil sa pangangailangan ng pamilya para mapag-aral nga, mabigyan ng maayos na pamumuhay na araw-araw makakain ng 3 beses, dapat yung gobyerno pa lang mismo ng Pilipinas magbigay na siya ng trabaho sa kanyang mamamayan para nga maiwasan na yung paghihiwa-hiwalay ng pamilya, dahil minsan yung paghihiwalay ang nagiging dahilan kung bakit nawawalan ng maayos din na kinabukasan ng mga bata, kasi iniisip nila pinabayaan sila ng magulang nila dahil hindi nila naiintindihan na bilang magulang, responsibilidad niyang tiyakin na makakakain ng 3 beses sa isang araw ang kanyang anak, makakapag-aral, makakapagpa-ospital kung kinakailangan, pero walang ganito sa Pilipinas at kailangan niyang lumayo.
Yeah, so, majority of us here living in the United States and abroad, in Canada and elsewhere, we are the product of, the worsening economic conditions in the Philippines and the labor export policy that Marcos Sr. Himself developed in the 80s. And like what Mimi said, our parents and families move abroad mainly to have a better life and better opportunities because in the Philippines, the wages are low. There's a lack of sustainable jobs being created, and the prices of goods, continue to rise. Next slide. So in this video, this is Lisa Masa, and with our parents and relatives working abroad, they face exploitative working conditions in which Lisa Masa will touch on.
I'm Lisa Masa. I am the president of Makabayan. So I have been representing the women's sector when I was congresswoman from 2004 to 2010. But before that, I was also representative of Bayan Muna from 2001 to 2004. Yung labor export policy, sa tingin namin, maling-mali. Kasi sa pamamagitan ng labor export policy, nagagatasan yung ating mga kababayan. Ang dapat na gawin ng gobyerno ay mag-create ng trabaho dito mismo sa Pilipinas. Hindi yung ginagawa talagang murang palakal. Yung lakas paggawa ng ating mga kababayan at kasama na rin yung katawan, no? Kasi marami rin sa ating mga kababayan, lalo na yung mga kababaihan, ang nabubulid sa prostitusyon, sa pagbebenta ng laman at nagiging biktima rin, no, ng sex trafficking. The Philippine government has really failed, no, in protecting our especially women who have become victims of trafficking. Problem about trafficking is that it is happening within the official labor export program. They were able to, these traffickers are able to really use their connections in order to, traffic, especially women and also including children. I think the large part of it is really going through the normal official channels like the immigration. Huwag nating isipin na yung trafficking ay ginagawa lamang ng mga like yung mga crime syndicates. Yung gobyerno ay isang malaking crime syndicate pagdating sa trafficking. Kasi yung labor export policy mismo ay nagpapalala ng trafficking.
Yeah, it was a really good combination that we were able to interview both Mimi Doringo and Lisa Masa, mainly how they talked about, why Filipinos migrate abroad, where more than 8,000 Filipinos leave the country daily. Next slide. So you'll see two images here. The bottom image shows a group picture of trafficked Filipino teachers in Washington, D.C. In 2016, Filipino teachers were promised teaching jobs in the United States, but ended up not having jobs at all, and to the point where the processing of their visas failed. So this is just an example of the exploitative conditions that many of our OFW relatives and family members face. And above the group picture is an image of my tita and I. My tita was one amongst the traffic teachers here in 2016, and so I was able to. I had the opportunity to be able to hear her story. The reality she faced being in a different country and not knowing anyone, as well as not having the job that she was promised to. Next slide.
So now that we've touched on the living conditions of the Filipino people, we're going to transition to the human rights violations we witnessed and learned about on our trip. These are updated numbers that the Karapatan Alliance have for the first 2 years of Bongbong Marcos's term. And what I want to highlight here is that although Bongbong Marcos is not as openly hostile as Duterte was in his term, the human rights violations remain alarmingly high. Next slide. And as of November, roughly a fifth of the political prisoners were arrested under Bongbong Marcos in his first 2 years. Next slide. So to begin our conversation on the human rights violations, we're going to talk about the political repression in Negros because it is a microcosm of the repression that's experienced throughout the Philippines. Now, if you aren't aware, Negros is the largest producer of sugar in the Philippines, but the farmers and the workers who till the land are some of the poorest and most exploited. Because they receive little to no support from the state, many peasants and workers get organized and fight for genuine agrarian reform so they have more control over their means of livelihood. But on October 20th, 2018, 9 members of the National Federation of Sugar Workers were killed by the armed forces of the Philippines while they were eating dinner in their tent in Sagay. The Sagay massacre and other high-profile killings of peasants and activists, such as human rights attorney Ben Ramos, became the justification for Duterte to declare Memorandum Order 32, which placed Negros Island under a state of emergency. He said that he declared MO 32 to put a stop to the lawless violence in the region, but ultimately it was used as a cover up of the killings and human rights violations committed by his administration. At least 50 peasants and activists were killed in Negros alone, and many of them occurred directly after the period of heavy militarization from MO 32. Military would encamp in the peasant communities in order to intimidate them into not organizing or joining the National Federation of Sugar Workers. And the political repression and militarization in the region led Duterte to carry out Executive Order 70, which created the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC. EO 70 institutionalized this whole nation approach, which systematically targets and persecutes activists and political dissenters through red tagging, surveillance, and other counterinsurgency programs. It has resulted in house raids, arrests of organizers and leaders, and the killings of human rights advocates like Zara Alvarez. Another important note to highlight here is that Negros has 121 out of the 755 political prisoners, so 16% of the political prisoner population. And just days before our Malaya contingent got to visit Negros, transport drivers were hit by water cannons by police for peacefully protesting, showing that no matter whose administration it is, the attacks on the peasants, workers, and activists remains a concern. Next slide.
All right. So, this video, so the Washington, D.C. and Baltimore contingent was able to sorry. I had to run because I had to get my charger. I was like, oh no, my laptop's about to die. So in this video, the DC and Baltimore contingent was able to interview at the Emily. And yeah, feel free to play the video. Well, they're getting their I think Emily is also a organizer with Pumalag. Pumalag is a peasant organization, and yeah, in her video
Emily
she
Francia. I'm a member of
talks about like the Bloody Sunday massacre in 2023 that happened under Duterte's administration.
Gabriela Party List 2019, in 2020 and hanggang 2022 naging HR po, Human Rights Defenders.
this year becomes a Pumalag organizer. March 2021, when Bloody Sunday Massacre happened. Rizal, Batangas, Cavite, Quezon, Laguna. Ang mga pinatay lang nila ay Rizal, Cavite at Batangas. Actually, lahat ng mga pinatay, lahat ng mga ni-raid natutulog that time. Nung pinasok kami ng madaling araw, nakakibol tie kami, nakadapa, hindi pwedeng lumingon, just only nakatutok ka lang sa pader na tinututukan ka ng barel. After 1 hour, tinanggalan nila kami ng cable tie pero hindi si Pang Mags. So naisip ko si Pang Mags lang ang kailangan nila kasi siya lang yung may cable tie. Pinatong lang nila yung 45. Pilit nilang pinapipirma si Pang Mags at pinapaamin na sa'yo tong baril na nakuha namin. Sabi ni Pang Mags, hindi ko yan pipirmahan, hindi ko aaminin kasi wala naman kaming baril. So dinala si Pang Mags sa munisipyo, kinulong. Nung ni-raid ang opisina, it was only the physical center that we put all the goods, the relief goods we have taken from the other organization, from the LGUs that we also bring to the community of Yulo. Kasi nga nararanasan na nila yung hamliting, hindi na sila pinalalabas, sinusunugan, hinaharas na sila, binubugbog para lumaya sila sa lupa sa Hacienda Yulo. Hindi pa natapos doon ang trauma namin sa pag-raid. Lahat ng message pumapasok sa cellphone namin na patay na si ganito, patay si ganito kasi parang pari-parihong oras ni-raid ang buong ST, pinatay yung ibang kasama. Ang wala lang talaga silang pinatay ay sa Laguna. Natanong ko lang sa sarili ko na ito ba yung katotohanan sa pinasok ko na kahit na wala kang kasalanan, ikukulong ka? Bakit ba ang mga walang kasalanan, yung tumutulong, yun yung pinapatay nyo? Bilang mga organizer, hindi kami sigurado sa buhay namin dahil isa kami sa mga target. Anytime, bigla na lang kaming mawawala kung gusto nila kaming abduct o gusto nila kaming patayin. O maybe, i-raid nila yung bahay. Mahirap po. Mahirap sa aming mga organizer dito sa ST. Naharapin at pilitin na maigpawan lahat ng kahirapan at pananakot sa amin dito sa buong ST.
Yeah, and then for those who may be new to, or never heard of what the Bloody Sunday Massacre was, it was a string of targeted assassinations by the Philippine military and police that led to the murder of 9 union activists and the arrest of 4 others. And so that's why when she was saying like it happened all simultaneously, that's what is basically that happened. Each region in the Southern Tagalog had an activist or more than one activist be killed by the Philippine military and police ordered by Rodrigo Duterte. Next slide. And one more. Yun. Okay, and just to show more on where Southern Tagalog region is, in that circle, that's the Southern Tagalog region. And maybe some of you here that's sitting on right now are from that Southern, or have families have Southern, live in Southern Tagalog region. But what Ate Emily said that, only 4 of the areas have had killings, where Laguna, where Washington, D.C. and Baltimore contingent integrated him. It was only imprisonment of the person that she identified as Pang Mags or Mags Kamoray. And next slide. And in that video as well, Ate Emily mentioned briefly of Hacienda Yulo. For decades now, families and landless peasants have been living and working in Hacienda Yulo, which is not a hacienda that we integrated in during our immersion trip. But it's still important to highlight this, especially when she had mentioned it during her interview. And the people who does live and work in the Hacienda Yulo, face harassment, burning of their homes, like you've seen in the video, and as well as hamleting. Hamleting is really a term where it's a herding of residents into special camps by the military or civilian authorities. Next slide. And this is another video of Janila Castro. But this time, the video highlights the human rights violations, specifically to what happened to her and Jed, another environmental defender in 2023 due to their work against the reclamation projects.
Aside from that, there are also human rights violations. Example in what happened to Jed and I, we were abducted last year because of our work on defending Manila Bay from reclamation projects.
Ang totoo po dinukot kami ng mga militar sakay ng van. Napilitan din kami na sumurrender dahil pinagbantaan yung buhay namin. Yun po ang totoo. Hindi rin namin ginusto na mapunta kami sa kustodya ng mga militar. Hindi rin totoo yung laman ng affidavit dahil ginawa yun, pinirmahan yun sa loob ng kampo ng militar. Wala na kaming magagawa sa mga pagkakataon na yun.
Hindi po totoo na kusang loob po kaming sumurrender dahil pinilit lang po kami. Nung gabi po ng September 2, naglalakad lang po kami sa kalsada nung meron pong dumukot sa amin. May tumigil pong SUV sa harap namin, tapos dinukot po kami, tapos pinilit kaming pasamahin sa kanila.
And if you go to the next slide. So just to give brief context of Neil Echo, unfortunately, we're not able to play it because we've run over long, but it'll be in the launching page of Malaya, USA soon. But just to give context, in May 2025 of next year, the Philippines will hold elections to fill the Senate seats as well as House of Representatives, and thousands of local posts ranging from governors and mayors and councilors. So in this video, Neil Echo from Alter Media really highlighted the political killings that happens during election season. And the Philippines has always had a problem with gun-related violence in the run-up to and during elections, especially at the local level, where political family dynasties and rivalries often end up in shootings that can be fatal. And next slide. In this last video, this is Ate Sharon Silva. She was a political prisoner during Duterte's administration when he was president, and she really talked about how she was imprisoned due to her, research on the conditions of workers in export processing zones, and even the fact that she's just conducting research. Herself was imprisoned to even show to the public the impacts of what these workers are currently doing or how they've been impacted in these export processing zones. And with these types of events and situations such as the Bloody Sunday Massacre, the political killings, and having political prisoners, these are not out of place in the Philippines, as human rights violations and war crimes, including, red tagging, harassment, and aerial bombings continue to happen without any pause, and to the point where it's also happening now under Marcos Jr.'s administration. And that's because, the U.S. sends significant millions of dollars of, military aid to our weapons, to training, and to the Philippine military and soldiers, allowing these raids, these harassments and assassinations to take place. And it's really why chapters of Malaya Movement USA and other organizations like ICHRP have been pushing to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act in the United States Congress, which really suspends U.S. aid to the Philippine military and police until it's been proven with accountability and investigations take place. Next slide.
So I don't think it was mentioned, but we went on our immersion trip this past September. which was significant because organizations like Bayamuna and Karapatan that we integrated with while we were there were a part of the martial law mobilizations happening throughout the Philippines. And while we didn't attend them while we were there, they ended up sharing this footage with us. A wide range of sectors were in attendance, like martial law survivors, youth, and workers, all in opposition to the resurgence of the Marcos regime. The call this year was Itigil ang panunupil, Marcos Singaling, Duterte Panagutin, which translates to stop the repression, charge Marcos, hold Duterte accountable. Next slide. In this video, Renee Ko from Kabataan Party List is a youth organizer, was sharing how the living conditions and human rights situation that youth experienced under martial law 52 years ago under Marcos Sr. are just as relevant today under his son Marcos Jr. Next slide. And in this video, you could play it if you'd like, but Emily Soriano, the mother of a drug war victim, was calling for the Marcos administration to let the ICC investigate the extrajudicial killings under Duterte's regime. Soriano laments that poor Filipinos lack the resources to raise injustices to courts, which further stresses the need for the accessibility of judicial services. This ties directly to the recent Senate hearings for former President Rodrigo Duterte. The Philippine Senate has been doing investigations on Duterte's drug war during his presidency. And earlier this month, Duterte testified before the Philippine Senate, where he admitted having a death squad, telling police officers to encourage suspects to fight back so that the officers could justify these killings as self-defense and taking full responsibility for the extrajudicial killings. Next slide. And these are just some more photos of the martial law mobilization that happened at Mendiola. And what I'd like to highlight here is that there's just all these different calls from the different sectors here. Some human rights and land defenders, youth and students and workers. And each of these demands not only calls for an end to the fascist and militarized regime currently in power, but also pointing the people to a future where human rights are upheld and the people's needs are met. Next slide. And we'd like to conclude our section with this cultural. So play the video, please.
Mga babaylan sa mga bukid at pagawaan, kinikintilang sumpa ng nakaraan nagbabangon ang mga babaylan.
So even with the Filipino people experiencing the harshest living and working conditions, exploitation, and political repression, the people are still finding ways to adapt and fight back. They're showing us the true meaning of the chant Makipaka Wag Matakot. So let's bring these stories into our communities and find our place in the fight against fascism and imperialism. And I'll pass it back to Tabitha and Adine.
Thank you so much, Noreen and Kylie, for really painting a really a comprehensive picture of human rights in the Philippines. You know, often when we talk about human rights, we think about the massacres of activists, the attacks on organizers, on progressive individuals, and the people. But it's really important for us to think about the impacts of basic rights of people not being met, those economic rights, their right to have livable wages, right to be able to afford food on their tables, right to livable housing. And so thank you for sharing really what the human rights situation is looking like under Marcos's Bagong Pilipinas. As we come to the 76th anniversary of International Human Rights Day on December 10th. It's really important for us to know these stories so that we can share them with those in our community who don't have this full picture of what's really going on in the Philippines. And so we'll transition now to talking about sovereignty for part 2 of our report back. Sovereignty is a long-standing issue that Filipinos have been fighting for under colonial rule, Spanish colonial rule, into US occupation, into Japanese occupation, and even to now. The Philippines has been fighting for sovereignty for over a century. And these days, the Philippines is really caught in the crosshairs between the US and China, who are not just vying for economic control of the region, but also military control of the region. That is especially affecting the West Philippine Sea and the major trade routes that are within it. And so, we've seen since Marcos took office, his desire to really sell out the Philippines. And Christiana from Union City and Mish from Seattle will talk us through what the sovereignty situation is looking like now. So I'll pass it over to y'all.
Hi, if we could go to the next slide, please. So our contingent, we got to visit the coastal fisher communities who are suffering the brunt of US and Chinese foreign intervention, particularly within the West Philippine Sea. Just some recent context, the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he visited the Philippine National Defense Secretary, Gilbert Teodoro, and Marcos Jr. to sign off on the General Military Information Agreement, and this just happened last month in November, and it will expand communication, the transfer of technologies and trainings, and also increase coordination between the US military and the Philippine government. And they sort of celebrated this. They celebrated the opening of a camp to facilitate this new agreement, and they also celebrated the addition of new EDCA sites. And during the visit, Lloyd Austin observed a Navy demonstration of a vessel that they claim the US will defend the Philippine waters. And so, like we see from this, the US has historically and is continually trying to position themselves as providing mutual defense as Chinese aggression increases towards the Philippines, specifically towards the Filipino fishers. But our members that visited Masinloc-Zambales observed that this US intervention isn't actually protecting the Filipino people. As Tabs mentioned, it's actively preventing fisherfolk from accessing their livelihood. It's actively causing environmental devastation, and therefore it's destroying the waters that the fishers rely on. The Balikatan exercises are an example of this. They disrupt the fish habitats and decrease the fish catch that fishers need in order to survive. And even with the recent typhoons that we've been seeing on the news, right, the US will claim that they're going to send humanitarian aid, but it's really them sending more US troops to the Philippines and to further the occupation and militarization there. And that will only lead to the increased human rights violations, the increased surveillance, and also the violence towards the communities and organizers there. Next slide, please. We also know that China has something to profit from its occupation of the West Philippine Sea economically. There are projects from Chinese billionaires like Ramon Ong from the San Miguel Beer Company. And there are also Dennis Yi, who's benefiting from creating these housing projects, which are high-rise, low-rise condominiums that the Filipino people can't afford, and yacht piers that are displacing urban poor and fisherfolk communities. In one of the communities that we visited in Santa Cruz, it's rumored that in an individual was collaborating with the LGUs on behalf of Ramon Ong, to carry out the land grabbing of small fisherfolk families there. So that's just indicative of a larger pattern that's happening along the coast, which is 20,000 fisherfolk and 220,000 families living in the Manila Bay losing their homes. Next slide, please. So we integrated with a community of fishers in Masin-Luxambales that used to be able to fish in the Scarborough Shoal, and that's one of the contested regions in the West Philippine Sea. And they would share with us that they used to be able to fish there alongside other nationalities, but due to the occupation by the Chinese Coast Guard, they're no longer able to fish there. Masinloc also used to have fisher associations in the area, but they were dissolved under Fidel Ramos. So our organizer, Tatay Joey, he was just sharing that their goal there is to kind of build more unity within the community, build more political consciousness within the community. Some of their needs being access to a public storage for their fish because they have to drive out to access a storage. And they also need more funding for diesel because they can't fish in the municipal waters. And this is because a lot of the community members were sharing that there's a coal power plant, and it's causing the water to be hot, and therefore it's killing the coral reefs and the fish. And so there's a decreasing catch closer to the shore, and they have to go further out. Next slide, please. So we spoke to one of the divers, Kuya Julius. He uses an oxygen compressor, so he gets on a large commercial vessel, and then he dives in the water overnight to catch fish at the bottom of the ocean. And he was just sharing that's because he no longer owns a boat. He lost a boat. He lost his boat 2 years ago after separating from his wife. And many fishers resort to this sort of dangerous work because there's no other options if you don't own a boat or don't have access to a boat. And his son actually works at the coal fire plant nearby. So many Filipinos are kind of pushed into industries that don't necessarily benefit their own community, but that's because there's economically no options for permanent or regular wages. And so these projects provide an opportunity for an impermanent wage. And he was also just sharing that he's afraid to go towards the Scarborough Shoal due to the water cannoning incidents perpetuated by the Chinese Coast Guard towards the Filipino fishers. And yeah, he gave us a free fish after we spoke. And so that's our organizer holding on to the fish because we don't have a bag. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is Tatay Efren, who was one of the families that we spoke with. He was actually water cannoned on the Scarborough Shoal. And this is just him sharing about the negative impacts of the US sending weapons to the Philippines. And you can play it now.
Sige. Di nabanggit niyo po na na yung China, inaalis pa tayo, tapos yung Amerika naman, wala nang aksyong ginagawa kapag inaalis tayo ng China. Sa tingin niyo po, ano yung dapat na aksyon naman na ginagawa naman ng gobyerno natin? Kumbaga, ano dapat yung response nila o yun, aksyon dapat na ginagawa ng gobyerno natin dun sa bansang China at Amerika?
Walang nagawa. Walang nagawa ang Pilipinas. Magpatrol lang sila dyan pero wala talaga. Walang nagawa ang Pilipinas. Ito namang Amerika, lalong pinagsasabong-sabong yata yung Pilipinas at saka China eh. Padalhan naman nila ng mga sandata. Pag makuha na naman sa China, lalong uminit. Lalo silang tumapang. Kaya Sana wag nang ganyan na wag na silang magkuha ng mga sandatahan na kuwan kay lalong nagagalit yung China sa ginagawa ng kuwan ang Amerika dapat silang magkuhan diyan ito walang kakayahan ng Pilipinas. Yung talagang totoong kakampi sila. Yun lang kuwan ko diyan sa
Next slide, please. So just on the left, that's the port, the night market that the fishers use to drop off and sell their catch. On the right, one of these heads are Ate Esther, who's a family member of Tatay Efren, and we were having a conversation, and she was just sharing that she holds a lot of, anti-China sentiment due to the water cannoning incidents of her community members. And she was also just sharing that she fears the war escalating because there's nowhere else to go. And she's also disillusioned with the Philippine government and Philippine politicians because they're full of empty promises. And influencers are at least better because they provide charity. And this is really, an indication of the state neglect that they are experiencing. And it's also representative of the other conversations that we had in the port with the community that people want to fish and they want to feed their families, but the government isn't doing anything to support them. And if war were to escalate, they don't have any military capability to defend themselves. So generally, it's the anti-Chinese sentiment is like strongly felt, but there is still like a sense that the U.S. will kind of come to their aid. And one of the takeaways from our contingent is just thinking of sovereignty. When we're thinking of sovereignty, it's not just like political or the ability to defend oneself against military aggression, but like we see in this community, their livelihoods are being disrupted by foreign policies around the West Philippine Sea, already by foreign intervention by both China and the US. It's not improving, and their livelihoods are tied up in their ability to control their own economy without foreign intervention. Next slide, please. We also had LGUs and PNP forces who were surveilling us because they overheard that we were talking to community members about how they felt about the West Philippine Sea and how they felt about China and the US. And one of the LGUs was asking, like, who are those anti-US activistas? And the community actually defended us and said that we were asking legitimate questions. And our learning from that, is just kind of showing how deep US propaganda is, the idea that the US will come to the Philippines' aid if war breaks out. But ultimately, the Filipinos and small fisher folk will suffer in a case where the conflict escalates further, and they're already experiencing the brunt of economic hardship. And to ask the community about how they're surviving or about their economic realities is somehow seen as a challenge to state authority. But that is the end of my section, and I'll pass it to Mish.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll be talking about our Washington integration in Negros. Yeah, we know that Negros, again, is one of the largest producers of sugar, not just in the Philippines, but in the world. And I think it's over 60% of its land is actually dedicated to the growing and production of this monocrop, this cash crop. And then 80% of the land overall is actually owned by these big landlords and these big corporations that reap the profits and don't allow the people actually tilling the land to benefit from the farming. And this kind of dynamic has really been established ever since the Philippines was a US colony even. Back then, the US was really reliant on, and still is, on Negros as its main producer for sugar, where they were getting all the imports from. So this was a relationship where the US was really, taking advantage of the cheap labor, the cheap exports of the Philippine sugar, that still continues to this day. And the collaboration between the big landlords, the US government, that legacy still holds a lot of power over the farm workers and the land, again, to this day. Some of the big landlord dynasties and families that we were learning about in Negros include the Villars, who also control the privatized water services in the island, the Aranetas and the Laxons. And these are families that have for generations held a grip over the livelihood of the farmers who actually work the land. I think we can go to the next slide. So while we were there in Negros, we were learning about the issue of land and how the land is, it's being suffocated through this use of this monocrop that's being exported through everywhere in the world. But it's also just increasingly being sold off for profit to foreign businesses and corporations. So we got the San Miguel factory over there. We have this is a Psy family owned land development, housing development, the Everyday Lush Living Parkville community. And just overall, we saw a lot of development tearing down the land to build SM malls or these resorts that were really catering to tourists. We saw in the airport all these different advertisements of these new fancy resorts and hotels and apartments that were clearly being catered to people outside of the Philippines to come and live in and have fun in. And all of that is at the expense of the people of Negros losing their land, losing their livelihood, the farmland that they use to feed their families on, and forces them outside to either the cities or across the world where they have to find livelihood. And this isn't this happens in collusion with the landlords who, of course, have control of the land, and then also the foreign corporations that are in partnership with them and get a cut off the profit. We can go to the next slide, please. So just to conclude this section, just want to really reiterate that when we were integrating in Negros, we were really given a heads up that this island, this province, was one of the biggest hotspots of oppression from the military in the Philippines, with the massacres, with the killings of activists, of peasant activists like the Fausto family. It's so prevalent in Negros, but at the same time, we see the people really fighting back. And we really see like the impact that our US taxpayer dollars have on providing the paychecks really for the military to be able to go into their homes and accuse them of being rebels or arresting them or interrogating them, or even camping out in their own backyards. Like our host mother, she had military stay by the rambutan tree that we picked from. It's very prevalent. And our taxpayer dollars, our billions of taxpayer dollars that we send overseas, funds their training, funds the guns that they use, funds their ability to harass and intimidate the people and kill them. But at the end of the day, the people are still really resisting that. So I'll just really quickly kind of read this quote from Nanay Moret, who is a peasant leader we met and interviewed in Negros. But she really says that, we have the drive to really fight for our land, but the militarization is a big factor. So the monitoring, the surveillance, harassment all over Silay. All association members of the National Federation of Sugarcane Workers are being harassed and monitored. Our leaders, our active members are being monitored. Some members of the association, even if they want to fight for their land, they struggle to do so because of the militarization. They are being intimidated. But then she says, but if you're not brave, you'll die of hunger. It's better to die fighting than to die of hunger. And I want to challenge the military rule. I am just fighting for my rights. That's why up to now, I'm alive and kicking. They're accusing me of keeping arms in my house. They keep coming back to my house. Well, they can check for themselves. I am simply organizing and educating, and I will keep doing so because our strength comes from the people. So that was a really big recurring theme we heard throughout our trip too, is that despite the fascism, despite the military oppression, we have a really big role to play overseas to put that international pressure on our own government to stop the killing, stop the oppression of the people. Because yeah, the people are fighting back, and even though we might live far away from our homelands, we can still fight with them as well. Yeah, I think I'll pass it on to the next person or tabs.
Thank you, Christiana and Mish. And thank you, Mish, for ending on your section on the note of resistance and folks in the Philippines, even folks who are really facing the most oppression and facing the most suffering, organizing together and fighting back. I know, we're trying to paint a picture of the issues in the Philippines, but we also want to pull out the picture of how the people are actually responding. And people aren't just taking it lying down. Like folks are actually stepping up to the plate and going toe to toe to even the violence of the military in the Philippines. Yeah, I thank you for that picture of sovereignty or the fight for sovereignty in the Philippines. As we're seeing, it's not just merely in the form of foreign military, specifically the United States military, which has now established so far 9 EDCA bases across the Philippines, which is just taking a pause to really think about it. Why are we letting a foreign military set its claws across the Philippines, essentially making it one big military base of the United States? So our sovereignty isn't just, again, in the form of foreign military presence, but what the presentation demonstrates, it's also the conduct and the orchestration of the Philippine economy. Sugar as a monocrop for export in Negros, that the main beneficiary of that are foreign corporations, multinational corporations, as well as their wealthy partners, wealthy domestic partners, like the names that were mentioned, Araneta's, the Lopez's, etc. So yeah, but again, through all of that, the fisher folk in the Philippines, the sugar farmers in the Philippines are all organizing amongst themselves to really raise protest and rally in their respective communities, just to push back against this status quo. So we now move to like the final part. I'm talking about Malaya Movement's principle of democracy. And I'm going to pass this to Daphne from Portland and Anna from San Diego.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daphne, and I'm with Malaya Portland. I'll go ahead and let Anna introduce herself and start us off. Do you want me to take slide one, Anna?
I think they can't unmute themselves.
Oh, okay, okay.
Elle, can you make Anna SD a co-host?
All good.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Yay. I was being silenced. So we'll go into democracy. Hello, everyone. Sorry, cameras right here. I'm Anna from San Diego. So land is the primary democratic issue of the Filipino people. On our trip, as we've heard from several of the trip participants, the stories of human rights violations and why they happen, and they all connect back to the issue of land and the fact that a vast majority of our people are deprived of their right to determine how our land and resources are best utilized for the Filipino people. So go to the next slide. So, there's like a common belief that genuine democracy happened after we ousted Marcos Sr. With people power. And now that we have had like Cory Aquino as well as other presidents come into the picture, but the role of the government is to implement policies that address and resolve the issues of its people. But the issue we have seen in these current policies at play are not genuinely serving the majority of the people and only serve a very small handful of folks, especially big landlords and foreign corporations. So, for example, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, CARP, that was under Cory Aquino, and then got an update, added extension with reform CARPer. These are actually sham land reform. It's supposed to provide equality and fairness in land ownership, but there are just so many loopholes and exemptions that favor landlords. And even when peasants and farmers are entitled to land with CLOA or the Certificate of Land Ownership Awards, which is a document evidencing ownership of the land granted or awarded to the beneficiary by the Department of Agrarian Reform. However, CARP and current policies don't allow for stronger protections against land grabbing or land conversion by big landlords or corporations who want to take agricultural land and turn it into commercial or industrial use. So we will be sharing what we got to see through our community integrations of how the issue of land and democracy is prevalent. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you can see here, folks from Negros got to integrate with groups of peasant farmers and farm workers who have been given their CLOAs, but there's just such heavy red tape bureaucracy around it, even though they have the physical paper and the title to the land, which states the plot of land, how much, and where it's located. And the process typically gets delayed. And in the case of these two haciendas we visited, the Lopez clan, which is a big landlord, will dispute the CLOAs, which makes the process even more challenging. It's which makes the process even more challenging. And the document is all in English. It's not in Filipino. And there's technical legal jargon that, the farmers don't understand. So because of CARP and not having genuine land reform, the actual plots that they're told when they're given the award is actually very different from what's on paper. And they're told that they'll get 500 hectares of land, but on paper it says 300 hectares instead. So these CLOA fights, include evictions from land, and like a lot of like discrepancies with what's told to them versus what's actually on paper. And a lot of folks have experienced their homes being self-demolished and being evicted from their land because they're told, oh, you can build your house in this area, but on paper it's a different area. So it's basically sabotaging them to kind of take away their land. And big landlords use the Pakyawan system to squeeze even more profit out of the haciendas. So farm workers get paid for different jobs worked, not per hour, but for just specific tasks and labor. So I'll pass it on to Daphne, who will speak more about the policies that the Negros community felt.
Yes. So because of the resistance in Negros, the island has actually really become a hotbed for intensified militarization, especially under President Duterte's Memorandum 32, which was mentioned earlier. And this is how we know that democracy truly is a farce in the Philippines with the current system, because leaders who are struggling for genuine land reform, where peasants don't have to go through this kind of red tape, who are organizing and even just conducting the basic right of teaching people what their cloas, what their documents actually say. People are actually getting killed for that in Negros, and that really intensified under Memorandum 32. Its impacts have even manifested in suppressing the right of people to tell stories of peasants and workers through cultural work, and engage in legal defense. Some of our contingent members also met with those who were in community, with organizer, paralegal, and mother Zara Alvarez. She was killed on the street in cold blood in Bacolod in 2020. We've mentioned Erickson Acosta, a really prolific cultural worker and human rights defender. Him and even his partner, Karima Tariman, also a prolific cultural worker and human rights defender, was also martyred in Negros, 2020 and 2021, respectively. So we can really see that the impacts of this kind of basically like de facto martial law are even impacting the realm of media, right? It's really manifested in a lot of media repression across the entire Visayas region. So another organization that we got to meet with is called Alter Media. They're a network of progressive alternative media outlets throughout the entire Philippines. And they've really taken up the campaign to free Frenchie May Cumpio, a journalist who was arrested in the Visayas in 2020. And her case is actually only really starting to move along just in the last few weeks. On November 11, she finally had the first time to testify and share her perspective in court. We even heard from Alter Media that the social media accounts of some of their members, such as Mayday Multimedia, are even starting to be shadow banned for supposedly inappropriate content, when they're really just trying to tell the true stories of those that are defending their land and defending their rights. It's even happened very recently to Malaya Movement USA. So we need pro-people media to show state neglect, not just tell the story of the problems and the horrible things that are happening, but also who is responsible and who the people can hold accountable. We'll go to the next slide. So we have to actually see landlessness as a driving force of migration from the Philippines. When land is being sold out to big capitalists and foreign companies, it means no source of sustainable livelihood for our people, a majority of whom still live in the countryside. So a lot of Filipinos are actually forced to go to the cities to find work to support themselves and their families, but they're faced with even more displacement actually by development projects that are not people-oriented and usually it can't be afforded by the everyday Filipino. So this was the case for those of us who got to integrate with residents of San Jose del Monte, Bulacan. SJDM was actually one of the first resettlement cities in the Philippines since the time of Marcos Sr., I think maybe even a little bit before. As early as the 60s, the state was resettling urban poor Filipinos whose homes were demolished in the urban NCR. And then they would be displaced to staging areas and resettlement sites. So this video here is actually showing a clip of us driving up to a resettlement site in SJDM. So you can see that a lot of the houses have a very uniform look to them. Some of them here don't even have roofs or windows and doors installed. We'll go head to the next slide now. So for people who are victims of displacement, they're really being denied their just even basic rights to housing and access to essential utilities. So supposedly people live in temporarily in staging areas before they go to the resettlement sites, like in the last video. But we actually got to meet some community members who had lived in staging areas for over 10 years, sometimes even 20. And even in the staging area, they're being coerced and manipulated and intimidated into self-demolishing their homes to make way, again, for more development projects. One nanay we interviewed said that residents are being asked to self-demolish, and then they will be moved into new homes, but usually it's literally just four concrete walls. There's some holes for windows and doors, but you have to install it yourself. If it has a roof, it's probably just like a very simple metal or tin roof, no electricity and no running water. So that was also a really big issue emphasized in SJDM, the issue of access to water. In the barrios that we integrated in, there's a private corporation owned actually by a political dynasty family, the Villars. And ever since their company, Prime Water, had taken over the public water district, residents said that water started to smell funny, it tasted less quality, and worst of all, it was less accessible. There actually was no guarantee of running water. So yeah, locals actually nicknamed the company Crime Water. Because one of the houses that we even stayed in didn't have water for a majority of the time that they were staying there. So every drop was really precious. So this cycle of poverty and displacement due to landlessness, compounded with the inability of the Philippine economy to absorb its workforce, you can see that it makes a lot of sense that many SJDM residents are seeking work abroad. 30% of them are actually overseas Filipino workers. And I'll pass it on to Anna for this clip.
Yeah, you can play this. It's really short.
We're collecting water from the Pandin Lake. You can see that there's a couple particulates floating around in here, so we have to kind of just agitate the water a little bit to clear it out and then just scoop out the clear water. You can really understand how the people are reliant on this source of water. So any kind of environmental degradation, any kind of pollutants that comes into the water directly impacts the livelihood of these people here.
Yeah, so that was Pandin Lake. And you can see that these issues also impact the residents. Pandin Lake is the only lake out of 7 in Laguna that is operated by a community cooperative rather than a private resort. However, it still faces threats of land conversion, where agricultural lands could be converted to industrial use. In this specific location, there's plans to turn it into a semiconductor factory and some subdivisions. And residents are also being coerced into and manipulated into self-demolishing their homes to make way for development projects, which would ultimately displace the communities. And like Mikey mentioned, the residents really rely on the lake because they use it for their own livelihood, whether that's through tourism, washing their own clothes, and using the water to cook their food. So we also just wanted to show, just in general, like all of the communities that we integrated, the issue of land, even islands, is an issue. So in Zambales, which was the community that I was integrated in Santa Cruz, there's the issue of land grabbing that had affected local peoples who had lost a part of their income because the local governor was complicit in grabbing these islands for private use. So these islands were before just open to the public, so no one had their name or title attached to these islands. So the fisher folk that we integrated with, they would, find their livelihood by charging a fare to visitors, taking them like on a boat to these islands for them to enjoy. But now that that part of their livelihood is taken away and they don't have access to these islands, especially the one that's farther out on the screen right now, it's now being used as a white sand resort where only a small handful of people invited by the governor are able to access those islands and go there. So the local community have been trying to organize and push back. So I'll pass it on back to Daph.
Okay. So in this next slide, we really just want to emphasize that the culprits behind this land conversion, the lack of access to basic utilities, they actually often belong to political dynasties in the Philippines, both local and national ones. For example, the construction company that actually builds a lot of the properties that displace residents of Bulacan, that construction company is actually owned by a mayor of the relative. And while we did get to meet urban poor organizers through them, we learned that there's another organization that is actually really trying to persuade and facilitate the process of self-demolition of the residents. And someone who played a significant role in that organization was the mayor's wife. So that's an example of a local dynasty. And a lot of Filipinos are getting displaced for projects like Camela Condos, which is pictured here on the left, and that is owned by the Eranetas, who are a political dynasty and also happen to be the family of Marcos's wife, Lisa. And then here you can see the water that our members who integrated in SJDM, the containers in there were all the water that they had to work with. And this was the fault of Prime Water, which is owned by the Villars. We also got to sit in on an anniversary by a peasant organization in a more rural barrio in Bulacan. This was a very simple celebration where we were playing games, eating food, singing songs. And the peasant organizers were actually celebrating 10 years of successful organizing and having successfully fended 3 land grabbing agencies off of their lands, many of whom were connected again, surprise, to the Arenetas. So here, even with those victories, we can see that we were actually still surveilled at this anniversary event. Kadaning, who is the president of the large peasants organization in the Philippines, we see a youth activist and the chair of the peasant organization. They're confronting these soldiers. And we're asking them, why are you red tagging us? Why are you acting like we're doing something wrong when we're celebrating this organization? And they kind of jokingly said that, no, we're not red tagging you, but they actually ended up surveilling us for the rest of the event. So we can really see that the interest of the state is to protect these profit-oriented schemes. And then I'll pass it on a bit more to Anna to talk more about the movement of resistance as well.
Yes, so to put us more on a brighter note, there are actually people who are really, well, besides like the on-the-ground organizers, there are people who are really trying to use the systems that we have to really hear the voices of the people. So one of the events that we got to be a part of was the Makabayan Convention right after our community integration. So as you can see, there's 11 candidates who are running for Senate in the Philippine midterm elections that's coming up, actually starting the beginning of next year until actual elections in May. And these are mass leaders. So they're leaders from various progressive organizations. We have someone who represents the workers, someone who represents nurses, the fisher folk, a woman, of course, teachers, urban poor, even jeepney drivers, the Moros, and of course the peasants. And of course, we also have progressive party lists such as Gabriela Women's Party, Kabataan Party List representing the youth, Bayan Muna representing everyone, ACT Teachers Party List representing the teachers and students. So if we go to the next slide, so during this convention, we got to really see, just in a small room, everyone represented from different sectors. And the general program that the Makabayan Bloc is trying to campaign for is really advocating for the livelihood and an economy for Filipino people, services for all, including the protection and assistance to OFWs, national sovereignty, environmental protection, human rights and peace, and legislature that genuinely advocates and protects for violence against women, children, Moro and Indigenous people, and LGBTQ+, actual democracy, such as banning political dynasties, and even pushing for honest and transparency in the elections process, and of course promoting a democratic pro-people culture. So you can play the video to see like how much, what will happen if everyone comes together. Yeah, and that is it for democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daphne and Anna, for again, like really illustrating well what democracy or whatever form of whatever democracy is striving to be in the Philippines right now. It's really very clear that in whatever Marcos is feigning as a democratic Philippines and his Bagong Pilipinas, that actually what the Philippines has is a way of governing that really just serves the interest of very few. The political dynasties that we talked about, that own haciendas, that own ports, that own roads, that own malls, schools, etc. And in Malaya, when we talk about what it means to fight for genuine democracy, we mean wanting the full participation of majority of the people in the country, especially the majority that is made up of peasants and workers. And so again, hammering home the point that land is the main primary democratic issue faced by the Philippines, the landlessness that people experience. Those are the drivers for the decisions that get made by those in power in the Philippines. And, what we're seeing really through the report back that we had from human rights to sovereignty, all of those are connected by these anti-democratic and anti-people policies that are put in place by these corrupt political dynasties that will long entrench, corruption and landlessness. And so, again, thank you so much to everyone, to all our presenters. This report back was our way of first sharing our experiences as Malaya Movement USA, going to the Philippines for the first time, seeing the issues that we have been fighting for since our founding in 2018. And so this will be the first time and not the last time that people will hear about this trip. And we're hoping to make this trip a yearly trip. And so before I start rambling more, we'll get into our calls to action today. And so as we'll continue to fight for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines, we really need a movement here in the United States that is steadfast in our commitment for those things. And so if you are not yet a member of Malaya Movement USA, you can join. You can become a member. We are holding a national new member orientation on December 20th. Link there. If you would like, we are dropping this new shirt. We should have put a picture on it, but we are dropping a Free All Political Prisoner shirt to support our campaign efforts. You can buy a shirt at that link there. Again, you can donate to Malaya USA. This is all grassroots efforts. We're all volunteers, but someone has to pay for the Zoom, for the website, and also to support our partners in the Philippines. And so all donations are very welcome. And then again, you can check out the Immersion Trip landing page at that link. We will update them as more stories get written, as more photos get chosen, and as more videos get edited. And that will be a big part of how we'll continue to share and uplift the stories that we're seeing, that we saw when we were there. And so, next slide. Oh, not next slide. We'll come back to that one. I also wanted to flash this real quick. You know, we are holding this report back ahead of International Human Rights Day. This is our national contribution to that effort. But if you are in any of these cities, please attend one of these actions in your area. I know a few of them are actually also report back, so you'll get to hear more stories, more experiences. So take a screenshot of this and attend your local International Human Rights Day action. And then if we go back to the slide before this, this will be our closing cultural. This is myself and Adine, your MCs for the night. The song is called Hacienda by the General Strike. And it's a song, it's a very simple song, and it illustrates the struggles of peasants and farm workers and really the struggle for land that is found throughout the country, right? You know, this was also written in response to the massacre of Hacienda Luisita. I was listening to this song when I was at Hacienda Kumabat in Negros. And this song really, captures this fight that people have, the challenges that people have in fighting for their right to till the land. And so Adine and I learned this song while we were in the Philippines. And so we'll just play this.
And that is it. That is the end of our presentation. But before you go, just wanted to thank everyone who is here and for participating. Thank you to the our participants who, the immersion participants who gave this really moving presentation. As folks remember, the name of this presentation or this report back is Hustisyya, or justice. And I hope that we were able to demonstrate that across the many report backs. For folks who don't know, Malaya was actually founded in 2018. A big reason being which was to resist the war on drugs that was raging, that was being executed by the previous Duterte administration. But as our members have demonstrated, injustice and fascism in the Philippines is built into our laws and the status quo. It doesn't have to be a violent campaign on a campaign against drugs and against drug use by the urban poor. You see it in our fisher folks not being able to sustain their livelihood despite feeding the country. Our farmers not being able to eat despite sustaining the country. While there's a few folks who benefit from their labor. We also want to recognize that as Filipinos in the US here, whether we like it or not, or whether we participate or not, we have a role in the fight for justice in the Philippines. As it was mentioned already many times, our tax dollars, US foreign policy, all have a stranglehold on the Philippines and the conduct of the Philippine government. So while we were talking about all of the issues that we witnessed, we also just want to pull out that one of the things that folks wanted to emphasize is really resistance to injustice, resistance to orchestrated suffering, and resistance to fascism. If folks know, in the Philippines, there's the use of the word resilience to describe the Filipino people, because the Filipino people are subject to a series of series of injustice like that is again built into our laws. Just this past month, the Philippines was also subjected to consecutive typhoons that actually took the lives of I think nearly 200 people just in the last month. So I think one thing to come out of this is we want to turn that word. We're not resilient because we are just suffering at the hands of foreign foreign multinational corporations and their domestic partners in the Philippines. We are resilient because the Filipino people have and continue to struggle for genuine democracy. All of this is also happening under the context of the the current president, Bongbong Marcos, or Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the dead dictator. And he calls his campaign, his administration over the Philippines right now as coins it as Bagong Pilipinas, or the new Philippines. But as we are seeing, there is nothing new. The conditions in the Philippines is worsening. But of course, this administration, which is very expert in disinformation, has painted itself to have this better image. But we can see human rights violations are continuing. Even the war on drugs started under Duterte is continuing. And not many people know that. So it's really similar to the dictator's Bagong Lipunan. So you see this, just a copy paste of son, father and son. That Bagong Lipunan that plunged us into generations of debt, plunged us into economic stagnation, and cemented the government's conduct of violence. But what we're hopefully what we were able to demonstrate is that genuine democracy means being free from violence from the government that claims to serve the people, free from hunger, free from being constantly deprived of the human right to live, free from being kicked out or kicked around and out of your home, of your land, from the threat of war, merely in the service of market interests of a foreign power, and not in the service of our safety and protection. So it's going to be a big, next year is going to be big for Malaya. We are also in like the shadow of the midterm elections in the Philippines, where there will be a reconfiguration of power, whether for the Marcos dynasty or the Duterte dynasty, and the progressives like the Makabayan bloc, really the opposition, will need all the help that they can get. So the next year will be a big reconfiguration of the political landscape, and we will Malaya members will be working hard to campaign in service of our principles of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty. So just want to repeat for folks, if you haven't joined Malaya yet, please join. Immerse with us, actually. Hopefully we can do this again soon, and have these fact-finding missions, and to bring it back to people here to be able to take action. We have our campaign to defend Philippine sovereignty, our campaign to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, our campaign against disinformation, to free political prisoners, etc. And yes, the fascism by the Philippine government that is sponsored and supported by foreign governments, and particularly the United States with its military dollars. It is a long-term fight. Therefore, we need folks to be organized and be organized for the long term as well. So yes, again, sorry, mouthful. I tried to put that into fewer words, but thank you so much for coming on. I hope this moves folks into action. And again, please join Malaya. Also, donate to the cost of our operations. They help us pay for the Zoom and other logistical and tech things. So yeah, thank you all. Good night, and hopefully see y'all at the new member orientation.
Bye, everyone. Shout out to the watch parties.